suggestions about what type of focus or what themes to look out for when dealing with patients. So, without further ado, let's start the gift of therapy. And now, we'll finally be moving on to chapter 1. Chapter 1 is called Remove the Obstacles to Growth, and I'll be naming here on the side the specific section this chapter corresponds to. If I am not mistaken, we were going to be starting by revising everything that has to do with patient and the therapist relationship. So, let's prepare our notebook. This is a very old notebook, so this is not one of mine, but I appreciate the roughness of it. It makes me feel like I can actually write here. So, here are the notes we made on the introduction and the acknowledgements. To go to the next page, a new page, because this pen kind of bleeds through. Should we continue with a blue pen, or should we grab a new color pen? I think we can keep going on with the blue pen. We'll alternate with the chapters. So, let's write here. Chapter 1. A little dash. Ready for our notes. Chapter 1. Remove the obstacles to growth. When I was finding my way as a young psychotherapy student, the most useful book I read was Karen Horney's Neurosis and Human Growth, and the single most useful concept in that book was the notion that the human being has an inbuilt propensity towards self-realization. I know what this psychology school is going at, but I can't remember the name, so I'm gonna leave it blank. If obstacles are removed, Horney believed, the individual will develop into a mature, fully realized adult, just as an acorn develops into an oak. What a wonderful, liberating, and clarifying image. It forever changed my approach to psychotherapy by offering me a new vision of my work. My task was to remove obstacles blocking my patient's path. I did not have to do the entire job. I did not have to inspirit the patient with the desire to grow, with curiosity, will, zest for life, caring, loyalty, or any of the myriad of characteristics that make us fully human. No, what I had to do was to identify and remove obstacles. The rest would follow automatically, fueled by the self-actualizing forces within the patient. So, Horney's Neurosis and the Human Growth. They say specifically this: people are fueled by self-actualizing forces. Therefore, the therapist's job is to remove the obstacles in the way of these forces. This is reminding me of what we said about what he postulates about the dynamic, the forces inside the person and with the environment. The self-actualizing forces, apparently there's good forces too inside. I remember a young widow with, as she put it, in a failed heart, an inability ever to love again. It felt daunting to address the inability to love. I didn't know how to do that, but dedicating myself to identifying and uprooting her many blocks to loving, I could do that. I soon learned that love felt true. Teresa knows. I don't know irresponsible. She was evil and jinxed, and her kiss was the kiss of death. It is actually quite sad to hear the way some patients will view themselves, and you can empathize with where they're coming from and where or what life experiences have guided them into having these beliefs. But it is still quite sad. We worked hard for many months to identify all these obstacles to her loving another man. For months we wrestled with each irrational obstacle in turn, but once that was done, the patient's internal processes took over. She met a man, she fell in love, she married again. I didn't have to teach her to search, to give, to dare, to cherish, to love. I wouldn't have known how to do that. I appreciate the humility in him to admit that there are things that you can't teach, that we can't pretend to teach, like this core virtues: to cherish, to love, to give. A few words about Karen Horney. Her name isn't familiar to most young therapists because the shelf life of eminent theorists in her field has grown so short. I shall, from time to time, lapse into reminiscence, not merely for the sake of paying homage to empathize the point that our field has a long history of remarkable, able contributors who have laid deep foundations for our therapy work today. One uniquely American addition to psychodynamic theory is embodied in the Neo-Freudian movement, a group of clinicians and theorists who reacted against Freud's original focus on drive theory. That is, the notion that the developing individual is largely controlled by the unfolding and expression of inbuilt drives. Instead, the Neo-Freudians emphasized that we consider the vast influence of the interpersonal environment that envelops the individual and throughout life shapes character structure. The best known interpersonal theorists, Harry Stack Sullivan, Eric Fromm, and Karen Horney, have been so deeply integrated and assimilated into our therapy language and practice that we are all, without knowing it, neo-Freudians. That is hilarious. And I mentioned this in the last video, but I have a lot of psychologist friends, and there's like a path of rights, like a commonality in people, that they'll all go through a phase or a continuing phase where they hate Freud. But to hear him say that all of us are kind of new Freudians in our own way, I'm gonna use that to butter them. One is reminded of Monsieur Jourdain Emilier Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme, who, upon learning the definition of prose, explains with wonderment, to think that all my life I've been speaking prose without knowing it. That's lovely. I'm going to jot down Neo-Freud. And the last names, because I have heard a lot of this before, especially diagnosis is unquestionably critical in treatment. Considerations for many severe conditions with a biological substrate, for example, schizophrenia, bipolar disorders, major affective disorders, temporal lobe epilepsy, drug toxicity, organic or brain disease from toxins, generative causes, or infectious agents. Diagnosis is often counterproductive in the everyday psychotherapy of less severely impaired patients. And I think, the way I said in the introduction, it is very important to consider that he's been treating moderately to mildly affected individuals. That's why he's making the distinction about conditions or well diagnosis and the labels being important for certain conditions and certain not. So I'll write it this way: diagnosis can be counterproductive in everyday psychotherapy. There we go. Why? For one thing, psychotherapy consists of a gradual unfolding process wherein the therapist attempts to know the patient as fully as possible. A diagnosis limits vision, it diminishes ability to relate to the other as a person. Once making a diagnosis, we tend to selectively inattend to aspects of the patient that do not fit into the particular diagnosis, and correspondingly overattend to subtle features that appear to confirm an initial diagnosis. What's more, a diagnosis may act as a self-fulfilling prophecy. Relation to a patient as a borderline or a hysteric may serve to stimulate and perpetuate those very traits. Indeed, there is a long history of iatrogenic influence on the shape of clinical entities, including the glaring controversy about multiple personality disorder and repressed memories of sexual abuse. And keep in mind, too, the low reliability of the DSM personality disorder category, the very patients often engaging in long-term psychotherapy. So, I'd like to make a comment more than an annotation in this, but I think the way he describes it here is wonderful. The inattention of aspects that don't fit and the overattention to features that appear to confirm. Can I do a comma? There's a bias according to diagnosis. And I actually am reminded of something a friend and a mentor told me when I started working where I'm working now. He said, don't listen to what anyone has told you about these kids. Don't look at the reports. You can look at them after. But first, get to know them, ask them questions, relate to them, and make your own interpretations. Not to ignore the opinions of other professionals, but to come to my own, and also don't do exactly this, the bias accordingly to diagnosis. Because like he says, if I had gone in there with a list of labels of diagnosis of these kids, I may have never been able to see them as more than that. And every person is a world, not just a series of symptoms. Let's go on. And what the therapist has not been struck by how much easier it is to make a DSM-5 diagnosis following the first interview than much later. Let us say after the 10th session, when we know a great deal more about the individual. Is this not a strange guy of science? A college of mine brings this point home to the psychiatric residents by asking if you are in personal psychotherapy or considering it. What DSM-5 diagnosis do you think your therapist could justifiably use to describe someone as complicated as you? The other annotation I Schopenhauer. In early youth, as we contemplate our coming life, we are like children in a theater before the curtain is raised, sitting there in high spirits and eagerly waiting for the play to begin. It is a blessing that we do not know what is really going to happen. Could we foresee it? There are times when children might seem like condemned prisoners, condemned not to death, but to life, and as yet all unconscious of what their sentence means. Or again, we are like lambs in the field, disporting themselves under the eyes of the butcher, and who picks out one first and then another for his prey. So it is that in our good days we are all unconscious of the evil that fate may have presently in store for us: sickness, poverty, mutilation, loss of sight, or treason. Though Schopenhauer's view is colored heavily by his own personal unhappiness, still it is difficult to deny the inbuilt despair in the life of every self-conscious individual. I was thinking of one to annotate, but I think it is precisely written down here: the inbuilt despair in the life of every self-conscious individual. Inbuilt despair in the life of every self-conscious individual. There we go. My wife and I have sometimes amused ourselves by planning imaginary dinner parties for groups of people sharing similar propensities. For example, a party for monopolists, or flaming narcissists, or artful passive-aggressives we have known, or conversely, a happy party to which we invite only the truly happy people we have encountered. Though we've encountered no problems filling all sorts of other whimsical tables, we've never been able to populate a full table for a happy people party. God, that's depressing. Each time we identify a few characterologically cheerful people and place them on a waiting list while we continue our search to complete the table, we find that one or another of our happy guests is eventually stricken by some major life adversity, often a severe illness or that of a child or spouse. This tragic but realistic view of life has long influenced my relationship to those who seek my help, though there are many phrases for the therapeutic relationship: patient, therapist, client, counselor, analyst, client, facilitator. And the latest, and by far the most repulsive, user, provider. None of these phrases accurately convey my sense of the therapeutic relationship. Instead, I prefer to think of my patients and myself as fellow travelers, a term that abolishes the distinctions between them, the afflicted, and us, the healers. So we're gonna write down his terminology. So I think it reflects a lot of his idea of the fellow travelers, the afflicted, and the healers. During my training, I was often exposed to the idea of the fully analyzed therapist, but as I have progressed through life, formed intimate relationships with a good many of my therapist colleagues, met the senior figures in the field, been called upon to render help to my former therapists and teachers, and myself become a teacher and an elder, I have come to realize that the mythic nature of this idea. We are all in this together, and there is no therapist and no person immune to the inherent tragedies of existence. One of my favorite tales of healing, found in Hermann Hesse's Magister Ludi, involves Joseph and Theon, two renowned healers who lived in biblical times. Though both were highly effective, they worked in different ways. The younger healer, Joseph, healed through quiet, inspired listening. Pilgrims trusted Joseph. Suffering and anxiety poured into his ears, vanished like water on the desert sand, and penitents left his presence emptied and calmed. On the other hand, Dion, Joseph rested one evening at an oasis where he fell into conversation with an older traveler. When Joseph described the purpose and destination of his pilgrimage, the traveler offered himself as a guide to assist in the search for Dion. Later, in the midst of their long journey together, the old traveler revealed his identity to Joseph. Mirabel Dictu, he himself was Dion, the very man Joseph sought. Without hesitation, Dion invited his younger, despairing rival into his home, where they lived and worked together for many years. Dion first asked Joseph to be a servant. Later, he elevated him to a student and finally to full colleagueship. Years later, Dion fell ill and on his deathbed called his young colleague to him in order to hear a confession. He spoke of Joseph's earlier terrible illness and his journey to old Dion to plead for help. He spoke of how Joseph had felt it was a miracle that his fellow traveler and guide turned out to be Dion himself. Now that he was dying, the hour had come. Dion told Joseph to break his silence and about the miracle. Dion confessed that at the time it had seemed a miracle to him as well, for he too had fallen into despair. He too felt empty and spiritually dead, and unable to help himself, had set off on a journey to seek help. On the very night that they had met at an oasis, he was on a pilgrimage to a famous healer named Joseph. As his tale had always moved me in preternatural way. Preternatural. I wonder what that means. It strikes me as a deeply illuminating statement about giving and receiving help, about honesty and duplicity, and about the relationship between healer and patient. The two men received powerful help, but in very different ways. The younger healer was nurtured, nursed, taught, mentored, and parented. The older healer, on the other hand, was helped through serving another, through obtaining a disciple from whom he received filial love, respect, and salve for his isolation. But now, reconsidering the story, I question whether these two wounded healers could not have been of even more service to one another. Perhaps they missed the opportunity for something deeper, more authentic, more powerfully mutative. Perhaps the real therapy occurred at the deathbed scene, when they moved into honesty with the revelation that they were fellow travelers, both simply human, all too human. The 20 years of secrecy, helpful as they were, may have obstructed and prevented a more profound kind of help. What might have happened if Dion's deathbed confession had occurred 20 years earlier, if healer and seeker had joined together in facing the questions that have no answers? All of this echoes Rilke's letter to a young poet, in which he advises, have patience with everything unresolved, and try to love the questions themselves. I would add, try to love the questioners as well. So I think what he's trying to show with this story of Joseph and Dion, the simple takeaway from this is that they both reach misery in their own social skills, intellectual curiosity, warmth, loyalty to their friends, articulateness, courage in facing their inner demons, dedication to change, willingness to self-disclose, loving gentleness with their children, commitment to breaking the cycle of abuse, and decision not to pass on the hot potato to the next generation. Oh my god, the hot potato to describe intergenerational trauma is just stunning me. I can write that down actually. The hot potato. Oh, this is chapter 5. Damn. Chapter 5. Praise the patient. Positive, supportive comments. I'm gonna make a little star. Hot potato, because I thought that was so funny. Hot potato equals intergenerational trauma. That's hilarious. Don't be stingy. There's no point to it. There is every reason to express these observations and your positive sentiments. Be aware of anti-compliments. Make your support as incisive as your feedback or interpretation. Keep in mind that therapy is great power. Power that in part stems from our having been privy to our patients' both intimate life events, thoughts, and fantasies. Acceptance and support from one who knows you so intimately is enormously affirming. Affirmation from veracity and knowledge is very powerful. It's not the same to give a compliment to a random person on the street, "You're so beautiful," and to tell someone who is late their soul is spared to you that they look beautiful. It will have a completely different effect. If you don't feel related to the person, if you don't trust them, believe them, then compliments or insults even won't make or have any effect. Let's go on. If patients make an important and courageous therapeutic step, compliment them on it. If I've been deeply engaged in the hour and regret that it's come to an end, I say that I hate to bring this hour to an end. And a confession, every therapist has a store of small secrets or questions. I didn't hesitate to express this non-verbally by running over the hour a few minutes. The betrayal! Now this episode is certain models of therapy. Often the therapist is the only audience viewing great dramas and acts of courage. Such privilege demands a response to the actor. Though pages may have utter confidence, none is likely to have the therapist's comprehensive appreciation of certain momentous acts. For example, years ago, a patient, Michael, a novelist, informed me one day that he had just closed his secret post office box. For years, this mailbox had been his method of communication in a long series of clandestine extramarital affairs. Hence, closing the box was a momentous act, and I considered it my responsibility to appreciate the great courage of his act and made a point of expressing to him my admiration for his action. A few months later, he was still tormented by recurring images and cravings for his last lover. I offered support. I think this is a transcript of this particular interaction with the patient. "You know, Michael, the type of passion you experience doesn't ever evaporate quickly. Of course, you're going to revisit it with longings. It's inevitable. That's part of your humanity. Part of my weakness, you mean? I wish I were a man of steel and could put her aside for good. I have a name for such men of steel. Robots. And a robot, thank God, is what you are not. We've talked often about your sensitivity and your creativity. These are your richest assets. That's why your writing is so powerful, and that's why others are drawn to you. But these very traits have a dark side, anxiety. They make it impossible for you to live through such circumstances with equanimity. Equanimity. I'm gonna look that word up after. relationship. I'm not exactly sure. Page 1 to 40, or chapter 1 to 40. I should have wrote that down better. I think it's chapter 1 to 40. So we still have a long way. Our little notes and summary. Chapters 1 to 5. In chapter person.